First came the passports, then came the warnings, then came the tanks. It was the exact same Kremlin formula that swallowed Crimea and ignited Donbas, and now Putin is trying it again in Transnistria, a tiny Soviet relic trapped between Moldova and Ukraine. Thousands of Russian passports are already being distributed as legal camouflage for future intervention. But this time, Moscow may have walked into a nightmare. Endless trenches, dragon's teeth, minefields, FPV drones, thermal surveillance, and battle-hardened Ukrainian defenses have transformed Transnistria into a fortress Russia may not survive attacking. The old Soviet intimidation doctrine is colliding with modern drone warfare and united NATO resolve. For the first time in decades, Putin's empire playbook may not end with victory, but with the public collapse of Russia's myth of invincibility. In the deep shadows of the Kremlin, old doctrines stirred once again. The same cold rituals that had been repeated for decades were awakening, like a dark wheel turning endlessly. Once more, the ghost of an old strategy crept out from the dimly lit corridors, carrying with it the icy breath of endless repetition. First came the passports, then came the warnings, then came the tanks. The formula was always simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. Moscow would issue thousands of Russian passports to people in the target region. Next came loud claims of persecution and genocide. Finally, the tanks would roll in under the banner of protecting Russian citizens. Each step was calculated with cold precision, like a predator that had memorized its prey's every move. This strategy was horrifying because it didn't just exist on paper, it had worked again and again. Putin had become addicted to his own success. Every victory made the Kremlin more arrogant. They watched Western governments panic, diplomacy freeze in helplessness, and maps change overnight. Russia had come to believe that fear alone was enough to make Europe bow. Repeated success had turned them into slaves of their own formula, and that would become their fatal blind spot. Now Transnistria emerged as the perfect next victim, a tiny, isolated Soviet relic, forgotten by time. Gray apartment blocks stood like concrete tombstones, Lenin statues gathered moss, old checkpoints rusted in silence, and abandoned military bases whispered of a dead empire. The entire scene looked hauntingly familiar, exactly like the early days before Crimea. Then came the passport decree. It was not mere paperwork. It was war preparation disguised as bureaucracy, a legal camouflage, a bureaucratic weapon that manufactured thousands of new Russian citizens deep inside Moldova. The slow machinery of conquest had begun. Today, passports. Tomorrow, claims of danger. The day after, intervention. Oh no, here we go again. But this time, something had changed along the edges of the old Soviet empire. For decades, Vladimir Putin relied on this predictable, brutal playbook to rewrite European borders. This formula of intimidation successfully froze Western diplomacy and altered maps from Georgia to Crimea, turning the Kremlin into a slave of its own success. But in Transnistria, a frozen Soviet relic of rusted checkpoints and concrete tombstones, the old magic has finally hit an immovable wall. The predator's fatal blind spot is about to be brutally exposed. Moscow expected the same submissive silence that followed their past operations, confident that fear alone would force Europe to bow once again. They failed to realize that history does not wait for the Kremlin, and the psychological chains of the past century were already snapping. The slow machinery of bureaucratic conquest was moving forward, but it was rolling directly into an unexpected trap, where the old rules of empire no longer applied. The Kremlin expected silence. Instead, it received defiance. On a cold stage in Chisinau, President Maya Sandu stood before a sea of Moldova's flags whipping in the wind. Cameras flashed relentlessly as her face, sharp and unyielding, filled every screen. What should have been another quiet capitulation in Russia's old playbook became something else entirely. Her voice cut through the air, steady and historic, like a blade finally drawn after decades of restraint. We will not be blackmailed. We will not be intimidated. Moldova chooses Europe, and we will defend that choice with every breath we have. In that moment, Moldova snapped. The small, frightened nation the Kremlin had long taken for granted was gone. A new one had awakened. Russia had handed out passports expecting gratitude and leverage. Moldova turned them into a curse. "We do not need Russian protection," Sandu declared. "Those passports are not shields, they are targets. They mark our people for isolation, for danger, and for eventual destruction." The narrative Moscow had perfected for years shattered in real time. What was meant to create loyalty and justification for intervention became proof of aggression. Putin was losing control of the story, and for the first time in decades, the predator looked exposed. 30 years of suffocating fear began to collapse in real time. Russian diplomats were expelled. Street signs switched to Romanian. Government buildings filled with urgent strategy meetings alongside European advisors. The old Soviet ghosts were being exorcised, one quiet but firm decision at a time. Moldova was no longer negotiating with its former master. It was preparing for confrontation, not with compromise, but with clarity. The psychological chains that had bound the country since the Soviet collapse were breaking apart, link by link, in front of the world's eyes. And then geography itself became Russia's worst nightmare. Transnistria had become a prison, a narrow strip of land squeezed between the wide Dniester River and Moldova's newly hardened border. It was trapped on all sides. No room to maneuver, no depth for retreat. Only a long, claustrophobic corridor of old Soviet concrete and fear, where every road led to a wall. What followed was a masterpiece of modern defense, built layer by layer with cold determination. Endless trenches snaked across the fields. Massive dragon's teeth concrete blocks stood like broken fangs, ready to rip apart tank tracks. Wide anti-tank ditches filled with black mud gleamed under gray skies. Minefields stretched for kilometers. Thermal cameras and drone surveillance watched every inch without rest. Machine gun nests hid in the tree lines, while mechanized brigades waited in hardened positions. At night, faint bunker lights flickered like dying eyes. This was not a border. This was a fortress. And as each new layer was revealed, the same chilling thought hit hard. This is impossible. Every Russian option now slammed shut like a prison door. Land invasion, blocked by layers of steel and fire. Sea support? Moldovan and Ukrainian drones owned the sky and river. Air assault? Pure suicide against modern air defenses. Strategic suffocation set in. There was simply no way in. Even the Russian troops stationed there had become ghosts, forgotten soldiers in empty barracks, exhausted guards patrolling rusting Soviet equipment, their morale as broken as the old tanks they commanded. Abandoned by Moscow, they waited in silence for a war their own country no longer seemed able to fight. The old rules of empire no longer apply. The age of easy conquest is over. But this crisis is becoming much bigger than one isolated strip of land. The rules of war had changed forever. Cheap Ukrainian drones now owned the night sky, turning Russian columns into burning wrecks before they could even cross the border. Constant satellite and thermal surveillance stripped away any hope of surprise. NATO stood more united than at any time since the Cold War, while Ukraine had transformed from a fragile state into a battle-hardened nation with modern weapons and unbreakable will. What once worked through sheer intimidation and old Soviet armor now met a wall of silicon, steel, and collective resolve. The Kremlin, still thinking in terms of 20th century blitzkriegs, found itself trapped in a world it no longer understood. The world changed. The Kremlin did not. The world changed. The Kremlin did not. Putin remained psychologically frozen in the old empire logic, a Soviet mindset that believed tanks and fear were still enough. He delivered the same fiery speeches from decades ago, invoking glory, protection, and inevitable victory, while outside his windows, modern drone swarms shredded his forces in real time. He saw maps the old way, as territories to be reclaimed by force of will, but the age of easy invasions had died. The man who once redrew borders overnight now stared at a reality where every move was watched, every advance was punished, and every lie was instantly exposed. He was a ghost of the past, commanding ghosts, fighting a war the 21st century had already rendered obsolete. For decades, Russia projected an aura of inevitability. Move against us, and you will lose. Resist, and you will be crushed. That myth had kept half of Europe frozen in quiet submission. But in the fields and skies above Ukraine, and now along the banks of the Dniester, that myth was breaking apart in plain sight. The limits of Russian power stood brutally exposed. What was once considered unstoppable now looked slow, clumsy, and fragile. The myth of Russian inevitability is evaporating in real time. Today, Putin's nuclear threats and fiery speeches collide with a wall of silicon, steel, and collective NATO resolve. Squeezed between a hostile Ukraine and a newly awakened Moldova, Transnistria has been transformed into an unassailable fortress. Endless trenches, dragon's teeth, and total drone surveillance have slammed every military option shut, leaving Russian troops as forgotten ghosts guarding decaying equipment. Small nations are watching closely, realizing that resistance is not only possible, but sustainable. The age of passive submission is ending because the world changed while the Kremlin remained frozen. Ultimately, this narrow strip of land stands as the potential graveyard of Soviet nostalgia, a place where an empire built purely on intimidation comes to rust, stall, and finally collapse under the weight of its own repetition. Across the region, a long-held fear began to evaporate in real time. Small nations were watching closely. They saw that defiance no longer guaranteed destruction. They saw that Moscow could be resisted, challenged, and even humiliated. One by one, the seeds of courage took root. What had been whispered in private rooms was now spoken openly. Resistance was possible. Transnistria was becoming the symbol of this shift, the potential graveyard of the Kremlin's doctrine of intimidation, a place where Russian power came to stall, rust, and psychologically shrink. The empire was not just losing land. It was losing its most valuable weapon, fear itself. The age of passive submission is ending. A new era of resistance has begun. And the longer this standoff continues, the more dangerous the Kremlin's dilemma becomes. Putin keeps playing the same game. He issues more passports, repeats the same threats, and waits for the familiar pattern of fear and submission to unfold once again. Trapped in his own repetition, he cannot see that the world no longer follows his script. Every move feels like muscle memory from a past century, the same playbook, the same arrogance, the same belief that history belongs to the bold and the brutal. But the board has changed. Tanks now face endless trenches and dragon's teeth. Nuclear threats meet swarms of cheap drones. The old empire logic collides with a modern battlefield where surveillance is total and courage has been rearmed. While Putin remained frozen in Soviet nostalgia, the rest of the world moved forward faster, smarter, and unafraid. History did not wait for the Kremlin. Transnistria now stands as the potential graveyard of the myth, a place where Russia's aura of invincibility may finally be buried under layers of mud, rust, and failed intimidation. The final warning is clear. Dark clouds gather over the old Soviet borders. What begins as a frozen standoff in a narrow strip of land may soon mark the irreversible decline of an empire built on fear. Eastern Europe is changing forever. The age of easy conquest is dead.